Hey friends, are you looking for a good, hearty, comfort food meal to serve to a crowd this fall? Well, this is perfect. I'll show you how I made these porcupine meatballs and homemade mashed potatoes. And don't get worried, no porcupines were harmed in this video. This is made from ground beef. This served about 15 people, but you could definitely cut this in half if you were just feeding it to your large family or if you're having a family gathering. So I started with 4 pounds of ground beef, 1 teaspoon of minced onion, 2 teaspoons of salt. This is such a delicious recipe, and what's easy is I made these the day before, so they could sit in the fridge and they were just fine for the next day. Now I also put in 1 teaspoon of garlic powder, and then about a half a teaspoon of pepper, and then about 4 teaspoons of Worcestershire sauce. Now you could definitely make these the same day. It just so happens that I had a lot going on the next morning and I wanted to have these fully cooked and ready to go the day before so I could just put them in the crock pot to warm up. It worked perfectly. Now you're going to want 1 egg for each pound of ground beef. So for this recipe I put in 4 eggs and I put in about a 1/4 cup of Parmesan cheese. I just eyeballed it. It just gives it a really kind of a nice flavor. Then this is what makes them porcupine. I added 2 cups of pre-cooked rice. Now I happen to be using the jasmine broken rice, so they're not as noticeable, but if you use regular rice, then you'll really see those little porcupines sticking out or the little rice granules. And then I think hands are your best tools, so I just put on some gloves and stirred that all up with my hands. Now what you're going to want to do is make sort of big meatballs. These aren't your tiny little meatballs. These are nice sized meatballs. And this recipe with 4 pounds of ground beef made about 42 meatballs. Now you're going to cook those in the oven at 350 degrees for about 35 or 40 minutes. But just remember to take their temperature when they come out to make sure they're done. Now I transfer these to one pan because you can see how they let out a little bit of grease. I didn't want that to cool and stick to them. So I transferred them to a nice clean pan. Now I put those in the fridge overnight, but you don't have to. That's just your choice if you want to make these ahead or not. Now the next day I'm going to make some gravy. And I'm going to do it the easy way. I really like this McCormick brown gravy. You can doctor it up with some mushroom soup or some mushrooms or anything you want to doctor it up, but I like it just like this. And those meatballs, when you heat them in the crock pot, they will let some of their juices kind of mix in with these. It will be really delicious. But when it comes to ground beef, it's hard to make your own gravy out of the drippings because the drippings are mostly just grease. So this is the way to go, in my opinion. I did 7 cups of cold water and 7 packets of the brown gravy and then whisk that together. And then as soon as it comes to a boil, it thickens up and it's ready to go. I just think this is a super easy gravy and I like it a lot better than jar gravy, to tell you the truth. Now here's the next day. I took my meatballs out of the refrigerator. I sprayed my crock pot with some non-stick cooking spray. And of course, this doesn't have to be heated in the crock pot. You could put this in a pan and put it in the oven as well. Poured some of my nice fresh hot gravy in there. And then I just scooped my meatballs in there. And I did want to kind of layer them with the gravy so they had a little bit of time to warm up. It took about 2 hours for these to warm up, and I did take their temperature just to make sure that they were warm. But once they're warmed up, they could literally sit on your counter on keep warm for a few hours. So this is great if you're not exactly sure when your guests are coming or if you have a lot of other side dishes to make. This is great to put these in the crock pot and just kind of forget about them. And you can kind of see in there the rice that pokes out, and that's the reason why they're called porcupine meatballs. And that's it. We're going to put the lid on here and we're going to let those go for about 2 to 2.5 hours on low until they get to a nice warm temperature inside. Everything is fully cooked, but you just want to make sure when you're cooking with a crock pot that everything stays to the right temperature. And now we're going to get some potatoes going while these warm up. And I used 10 pounds or 2 5-pound bags of yellow potatoes. Yellow potatoes are my favorite for everything. They're great for soups, they're great for baked potatoes, and I love them for mashed potatoes. They just have a very nice, moist, soft texture. So I just peeled those, cut them all up, and we're going to get them on the stove and get them to a boil. I like to cut my potatoes in a little bit smaller chunk just so they cook evenly and quickly. The great thing about mashed potatoes is once you have them cooked, they can sit on your stove or in a crock pot for a long time and keep warm, and their consistency stays wonderful. Now, of course, potatoes are starchy, so it's just my habit. I like to rinse them twice just to make sure we get as much starch off as we can before we cook them. And because I peeled and cut so many, I actually have 2 pots of these. We're just going to let those come to a boil and then simmer them until they're tender. And I like to have them very tender before I start mashing them. Now, you cannot forget the butter. And for 5 pounds in this one pot, I actually did use 1.5 sticks of butter. That's really up to your discretion, however you like them. And then I just did a little splash of half and half because we had it. You could also use milk or heavy cream, whichever you have is going to work just fine. And you don't need any fancy tools. I just used my regular old potato masher. And because I cooked these till they were nice and tender, they mashed up perfectly. Now, don't forget to add salt to these, but you really want to salt them to taste. Add a little salt, stir it up, taste it. Add a little more salt, stir it up, taste it. Just because you don't want to salt your potatoes because you are going to put that salty gravy on top. Now, because I made them in 2 different pans, I actually did put them together in one, and I mixed it all together just to make sure that they all had a consistent flavor and texture with the salt and the cream and everything that I added into them. And then I just put them in the crock pot, and like I said, these can stay on keep warm for hours, literally hours, 4 hours or more. They're going to stay at a nice warm temperature, and the consistency, everything will be perfect with these potatoes. And there you have it. This is a porcupine meatball supper for a crowd. This served about 15. Maybe if you had kids, it would serve up to 20. If you want a smaller batch, just definitely cut this in half. But it was so delicious, hearty, perfect for fall. Throw a couple of veggies on the side and maybe some crusty bread. And this is a great meal for a crowd. Serve it at your next family function. I hope you guys love this one as much as we did. Thanks for watching.